Good afternoon. Welcome to today's webinar. So we will be reviewing your cloud readiness and your migration strategy within this webinar. My name is Rigg. I'm head of solution architecture for managed services here at Perfect Image, and my focus is around public cloud, specifically Microsoft Azure, AWS, and Microsoft 365. Just a bit of background so you know who's talking today. So I joined Perfect Image back in 2018 from Toshiba, Australia, where I was working within their managed services division as a solution architect. So today we'll cover why public cloud. So understanding what you're trying to achieve is key. And business continuity has emerged as a top priority for many organizations, even before the effects of COVID was felt. The need for robust plans to enable operations to continue, no matter the situation, has never been more critical, right, and crucial, considering the impact and changes from an office-based workforce to a remote-first workforce. In cloud adoption terms, COVID has simply increased the speed of cloud adoption, and transformation. In many cases, it's compressed what may have been years into a period of a few months. We'll also cover off kind of assessing your cloud readiness. So I'll break this down into sections, including size. Yes, it really does matter, as it affects the costs, the timeframes, and almost certainly adds complexity. I'll talk about a few aspects of the cost too. So how much will it cost to host your workloads in the cloud? The costs of doing nothing. So staying where you are, not benefiting from the agility public cloud has to offer. And then also, the cost of getting to the cloud. Also, how aggressive are your timeframes? It's not only the current environment we find ourselves in, and for one of the reasons to reassess our timelines, but we also need to consider the costs associated with a delayed or extended migration. Not all cloud migrations are quick. They can take years, but it's important to have this planned and understand the costs associated with an extended migration. When choosing your public cloud provider, you've got a few to consider. AWS and Azure are currently the preferred kind of go-to providers, but then you've also got GCP, so Google Cloud Platform. But GCP is no way as mature, so they'll not really be mentioned throughout this presentation too much. Then lastly, I'll discuss creating a cloud migration strategy, and I'll break this down into sections, including define, build, plan, ready, adopt, govern, and manage. So throughout this webinar, I'll be checking for questions, and I'll try to cover off as I go, but we'll also finish off with a Q&A session. So any questions I haven't got around to, we'll kind of cover them off then. But just to start with, I'm just going to do 2 quick polls to start with, just to kind of get an idea of kind of where you're at with a few things. So I'll just launch this poll, and I'll just give 30 seconds for some responses to come in. Let's get a couple more seconds. We've got most coming through. Okay, so we got 80% of people voted, so I'll close the poll. And so these are our results. Right, so we've got the majority intermediate. That's good, perfect. So I'll close this one here. Let's do one more quick poll. Just give it a few more seconds. Say we've got most in again. Okay. All right, so whatever was in the fridge wins. And then don't have time, and I'll swap out for this. A nice bit most too. All right, well, I'll crack on into the webinar now. Right, so First of all, documenting your cloud strategy. This helps stakeholders understand the business outcomes, that the organization, are pursuing by adopting the cloud. We start with your motivations. So we've got to meet with stakeholders to define the motivations behind the cloud adoption. Next comes the business opportunity. So now we're engaging with these stakeholders, to document those specific business outcomes. We then move to the business justification stage. So this is where we'll develop the business case to validate the financial model that supports the motivations, and outcomes. Then the kind of next step there is that kind of cloud readiness, the readiness assessment. That's kind of what we're discussing today, but that one there can kind of, does kind of cover all throughout this, throughout those three as well. And then we kind of move to, your first cloud adoption project. This will help align the motivations, with the technical efforts. But so we'll dig a little deeper into each of these as we kind of go through the next couple of slides. So some common challenges the businesses face, and the reasons for developing the cloud migration strategy are as follows. So legacy applications, and the migration risks and challenges, that come with years of intertwined and disparate systems. Outdated hardware or server facility. Maybe you've got a refresh of hardware due, or you've got current capacity issues, but you don't really have the budget or the desire to upgrade mid-cycle. Local resource constraints, again, so due to the legacy distributed data center designs, those typical growing pains, the stopgap solutions that were implemented without the detailed plan, or simply reacting to cloud growth. Slow response, so slow response to business requirements. It can take weeks, or months to provision new resources, even if these are virtual, on-prem. Because you may have had to provision additional hardware to meet those requirements. And then the lack of robust disaster recovery capabilities. So disaster recovery solutions can be expensive, and it can kind of sometimes be seen as more of an insurance policy. But the more that you kind of have those very low RPOs and RTOs, so your recovery point and recovery time objectives, the costs for these increase. So up on screen are the key critical business events, your migration triggers, and innovations to consider when moving to public cloud. When engaging with stakeholders across the business, and discussing technology, it's important that everyone understands the benefits, and your motivations for the cloud adoption. Perfect Image will typically run workshops with you, but we've also got various templates and documents to help capture the right information and help identify the business outcomes. General questions and topics that are covered are, for the likes of, what do you expect from your move to the cloud? What are you moving to the cloud? Are your applications cloud ready? Do you have the right in-house skills to manage a cloud environment? Or what's that kind of skills transition plan? What are your short, medium-term, long-term objectives? What are the risks you've identified? So these are just some of the topics, that are generally covered. So there's many reasons, why you should use a public cloud. It's often the same reasons for both AWS and Azure, unless you're using a specific cloud native solution that only one of those vendors provide. So I'll cover my top 8 reasons for why to move to the cloud. Starting with agility, right? So you may expand your current environment into the cloud. If you've got those resource constraints for compute, storage, or whether you've got those seasonal demands. The ability to have your environment automatically scale, when your users or customers require it, and don't pay for those idle resources. Consolidate those physically separated systems into a single logical public cloud estate while maintaining the geographic data locations for compliance. No more hardware lifecycle. No need to scope or future-proof those hardware purchases. Then if we kind of move into timelines for procuring and deploying infrastructure, that changes from weeks or months to days or hours. When we kind of hit the large scale compute or intensive workloads, this is where you can bid for cheap compute. For those non-time sensitive processes, they can be queued to run whenever cheap compute power becomes available. The flexibility to change your server types, so change from, say, general purpose VM to a CPU, RAM, or GPU optimized instance, change as your needs change. Then backup, disaster recovery. So those advanced disaster recovery solutions, can be achieved for a fraction of the cost. And they, and may have been once cost prohibitive, when you tried to implement these within your own data centers. It often meant purchasing duplicate hardware just to protect yourself for that kind of just-in-case event. Within the cloud environments themselves, so AWS and Azure, you can either use like the likes of Cloud Endure or Azure Site Recovery to replicate from on-premise to cloud, or replicate your existing cloud workloads to a second region or a second cloud provider. So protect against those regional or cloud provider outages. So cost reductions, right? You've got multiple choices on how workloads are consumed and built within public cloud. You've got your on-demand, pay-as-you-go. It's basically pay for those instances that you launch. Gives you the most flexibility, but it will cost you the most if you're running 24/7. Reserved instances, reduce your costs by making a commitment to a constant compute level. Spot instances, so these are the ones where you bid for those kind of unused server instances. This can reduce your costs significantly, but your workloads must be able to start and stop at any time. Then you kind of get to dedicated hosts, so you're effectively renting the physical host, so it's fully dedicated to running your instances. And this is where you can kind of bring your existing kind of per core, per socket, per VM software licenses to further reduce costs. Facilities and real estate. So running in public cloud, you've got very, very minimal issues when you're looking to move premises. Once in the public cloud, you can move offices, work from home, do what you need to do without having those limitations and challenges required with moving resources. Information security, last but absolutely not least. So people often perceive the cloud to be insecure. However, in public cloud, your data is encrypted at rest. Infrastructure is behind enterprise class systems, firewalls. Even for the smallest of deployments, you're in total control of your virtual private cloud. So data sovereignty, you control where you want to deploy your data. UK South, Europe, wherever you actually want your data, wherever it needs to be, is where you can deploy it. Also, like for another one here, so Microsoft, right, that they invest over £1 billion each year into the security of its platform and offerings. So today's enterprises are faced with a complex cloud environment. They're managing cloud spend across the organization. It's becoming increasingly difficult. You may have or require hundreds of resources are running across multiple cloud environments, using IaaS, SaaS, and PaaS products. But they'll also span across different business units, and each having their own requirements. IT executives, they need to understand the cloud spend across their organization, to ensure the best ROI. Your finance teams, they need to improve cloud spend forecasting, and drive more accountability across those teams. But then you get your project teams, so they need to deliver more services with the budget that they've been given. So up on screen is a scenario based upon a lift and shift, right? So the costs for cloud hosting can vary wildly, right? And this is why it's important to not simply lift and shift based upon current server specifications. Optimization doesn't have to take place after the fact. Optimization for the cloud, for cloud workloads start during the planning phase, using tooling to assess the actual workload requirements. When we use tools like AWS Migration Evaluator, I've got a little demo for that one kind of coming up later, but the cost difference between these three types on screen on screen can be huge. So VM1, I'm going to call it M5 2 extra large, AWS terms, 8 CPU, 32 gig RAM. If it's on pay-as-you-go, it's going to cost you around £470 a month. But VM2, so now it's an M5 extra large, so it's the next size down. 4 cores, 16 gig of RAM, still pay-as-you-go, but now it's around £240 a month. But VM3, so now we're an M5 large, So 2 CPU, 8 gig of RAM, and it's on a savings plan, and it'll cost you around £112 a month. So this is kind of why right-sizing your environment, for each workload is so important in trying to answer the question is, how much will it cost to host my workloads in the cloud? Don't move or kind of use the pricing based upon the current provisioned resources unless you understand what each server application actually requires. I'll just pause for a minute just so you can kind of read those couple of 3 questions on the screen. So I just want to cover off some of the main phases in a cloud migration. So these can be linked back to costs. So if one of the reasons for moving to the cloud is to reduce your cost, generally the larger the infrastructure estates, the more cost savings can be made. This is, of course, if you don't get stuck in the migration bubble. So during the assessment and business case stage, you must make it clear, excuse me, that there'll be a period of increased costs before you reach the Tco phase. It's important not to extend the migration timeframes, during the project beyond what was planned, unless there's very critical reasons for doing this. The longer the migration bubble, and those increased costs will be felt. This is why you don't want a stalled cloud migration, as the cost will continue to climb with little to no reward, and the project becomes at risk of failing. That migration bubble, so it consists of planning and assessments, duplicate environments, staff training, third-party tooling, any kind of lease penalties. Next comes the Tco phase, so your monthly costs are now at the projected spend before we move into the payback period. So but this will depend upon the length of that migration bubble. But you should simply not just stop once you're in the cloud. Cost optimization and right sizing should continue, and you also should continue to evolve those workloads and use more cloud native services. As this has a huge impact, a big impact upon the cost reductions if done correctly. So during the discovery phase, we need to look at the costs, costs and savings associated with the move to public cloud. When we look at these items, some will be cost increases, while others provides cost reductions. We need to identify all areas, not just the hosting costs, so your infrastructure costs. But they all need to be taken into account. It's not about, it's also about assessing the applications, the migration itself, the people and the third-party costs. I'll run through the infrastructure costs quickly and just pick a few to consider within the other areas. My point here is there's a lot to consider, and today's session isn't long enough to kind of run through all these. So starting with infrastructure, right? So cost-wise, you've got your data center costs, facilities, lease term remaining, any kind of lease penalties. But then kind of when you look at the savings side, well, you no longer have those direct costs related to power, cooling, backup, disaster recovery, those duplicate sites. Data center management costs, you also may have a reduced footprint, if you still need a small environment. Connectivity, so those lease lines, to those data centers. So within infrastructure, then we kind of move down to the server section. So this is where we kind of need to assess, the physical or virtual servers, the specifications, CPU, cores, RAM associated with each instance. But they can then continues, right? So you move into storage, your SAN, your NAS, networking connectivity. What's the peak throughput requirements? Any upcoming refreshers? But then also considering any existing kind of end of life plans. So infrastructure savings can be significant in the business case because of the typical overcapacity within data centers. So this just leaves us with, application, migration, people and third-party costs. So example of costs associated with application costs are licensing. Can these licenses be transferred? Any upcoming license renewal, disaster recovery requirements, and kind of that high availability or fault tolerance element of things. Then you've got costs considered with the actual migration itself. So planning, design, documentation, testing efforts, duplicate environments, the kind of cutover and rollback plans. People costs covers items more like, direct costs, right? So this can either be with employees or the indirect costs with contractors, recruitment, retention, replacement, the training and development costs, any kind of physical space or requirement and services. But then lastly, you kind of get down to the third-party costs. So these are basically any other costs, right? So any kind of lock-in, any contract costs, lock-in deals, early termination penalties, software licenses, so orchestration tools, migration tools. Just going to pause for a second here just to make sure there's no questions. So you can chuck something in the chat if you like, or there is a question section as well. So nothing there yet, so I'll crack on. So choosing the right cloud vendor, it comes down to your requirements, right? So your wants versus your needs, and these are different for each business. We need to assess the workloads you have now, but also need to consider, what's your roadmap, and what's your overarching kind of cloud strategy. Also, you also need to balance out the rate of change within the cloud providers. So, what provider is more aligned to your requirements now, but also we need to keep an eye on their roadmaps. AWS has close to a 7-year head start on Azure, right? So this means that some of their services are by far much more feature rich, especially when you're looking at some of their cloud native services. So AWS, it's got around 35 to kind of 40% of the market share, with Azure, Microsoft Azure kind of having that kind of 30 to 35%. This is for the public cloud market. But what I'll say, in generally speaking, is that the IaaS offering, so your infrastructure as a service, it's close to parity for both of these providers. So there's a remaining 30%, right? And these are for kind of all the other cloud providers. So for the likes of Google Cloud, IBM, HP, Alibaba, and kind of any other kind of cloud provider or public cloud provider offering you can think of. But so trying to align what cloud provider or all cloud providers are the best fit for your business isn't as simple as saying if you use Microsoft 365, then you should use then you should use Azure. In fact, AWS has more Windows workloads running in it than Microsoft does. But again, that's no reason to choose AWS. So in the next few slides, I'm going to start to discuss components that are involved within assessing your readiness, and use this to build a cloud migration strategy. Throughout the process, the choice of cloud vendor or vendors, if you're implementing that multi-cloud strategy, becomes more clear. So when we move into kind of developing the business justifications, these are just some of the common myths, that typically they're always brought up by somebody. They need to be discussed and understood. A lot of these do fall around costs, like, for example, cloud is cheaper, or cost should be the main driver for a migration. But cost shouldn't be a main driver or focus for moving to public clouds. One of the main benefits of cloud is the agility and innovation, that grows out of that agility. Don't simply lift and shift your workloads. Yes, if you do lift and shift your workloads, there will be benefits for doing this, but doing this alone will probably cost more. And if cost reductions is a driver for cloud adoption, then you will not continue, and you haven't continued to optimize and assess your environments and use some of those cloud native resources, then you will not see the benefits for moving to public cloud. Then there's the security question. I'd need 45 minutes alone to talk about this. But to say public cloud is not secure is simply not true. I would strongly argue the opposite. The controls that are available to you, they're all enterprise level. And generally you cannot normally afford to implement these if you're on premise, or in a private cloud, unless you're FTSE 500. But then I'm still going to argue cloud's going to have the edge over these ones. So assessing your cloud readiness and then kind of detail that we gather feeds into the business case. This provides answers to the common questions that you'll be asked if you just happen to start using the cloud. You'll be asked some awkward questions like, why are we getting these bills from AWS or Microsoft? What workloads do we have running? Who will approve this? It's actually quite common, for companies to be in the cloud, using public cloud resources and running critical business workloads before the business asks, what's our cloud migration strategy? So doing the groundwork on the readiness or migration assessments helps validate the business case, and it helps de-risk cloud migration. Assessing the cloud readiness along with building the business case provides the answers to the questions up on screen now, and feeds into that all into your overall cloud strategy. So as I said, the cloud readiness assessment, it's part of building a business case, right? But understanding which type of approach is required when developing the business case, it will depend upon your cloud maturity and the information you require. The two main types of business case are kind of directional and detailed. Directional is more commonly used for budgetary purposes, and it should provide the costs within 20% plus or minus of the final costs. But now, depending upon the size of your workloads, this could add or reduce tens of thousands per month to your hosting costs. So directional is a good starting point, but it will often move into a detailed business case well before any workloads have been migrated. So evaluation tools are used to assess your current cloud infrastructure, right? Your current on-premise infrastructure. And it helps us to understand, the kind of cost modeling, those right sizing options. We look at the operating systems, any SQL license requirements, network considerations, including latency and dependencies. So I've got a quick demo for the AWS Migration Evaluator, as an example of a tool, of one of the tools we have access to. And it allows us to ask, to simply answer the question of, how much will it cost me to host my servers, in this case, within AWS? And it provides that kind of like-for-like comparison, and also a right-sized servers based upon the lift and shift. So to get the data we require, a small VM kind of ingests the data and feeds it back to be analyzed. We can even ingest data from other systems. So by adding tags to the environments, you're going to get more feature rich here. But the detail we kind of get is we can look at our individual applications and the costs associated with running these on-premise. Now, zombies, what we have here is these are basically servers that have been idle 100% of the time that the assessment was performed. More on zombies shortly. But if we kind of go back to the environments, right? So we can now dig into how much is it going to cost overall per year, based upon either standard metrics or your own for development, production. So this is all about your current kind of costs for running on-prem. But as we move into the cost modeler, this starts to give us the elements of how much will it cost me to move my environment, it's in production environment, or my applications to public cloud. So we can break that down right down to each individual application if you want. This all depends upon the tagging structure. But if we go back into environments here, and what this is going to quickly show us here is it will show us the estimated cost of kind of what that environment that you have on-premise costs you per year versus the scenarios that we build up within, in this case, AWS for 3 years all up front, or a 8 hours pay-as-you-go scenario. Now, it gives us our kind of direct match side of things. So under the direct match, this is your like for like. And in this case, it was for all up front, 3 years. Then it also gives us the right sized. So this is actually using servers and using the data based upon the actual usage requirements. And again, it gives us this as well for our second scenario we built here for our kind of 8 hours pay as you go. So our costs associated here. So what we're going to do here quickly is we're now on the kind of DR environment. itself. And if we edit the scenario for this 8 hours pay-as-you-go, because in a DR scenario, you're not going to run 8 hours a day, right? So let's change this down to say 2 hours per day. Ideally, you're not going to even be that, but it just gives an idea of kind of the costs and how quickly within the scenario it can change. So our current cost hasn't changed, so it's still 700,000 for our DR environment, but our cost for our pay-as-you-go has now reduced from like 165 to 77,000. So now that's just 2 scenarios there. We're going to quickly add a third scenario, but you can add as many scenarios as you want, within here. So we first of all pick our region. So this is there for the resources and the costs. And so we're going to pick our kind of our preserved instances 1 year not upfront. We can either choose to add zombies or exclude zombies, and we can adjust our CPU scaling. So if this report or this assessment was run during kind of a slow period. And we can also look at our SQL licenses. Do we want to bring our own, or do we want AWS to provide them? Give it a name. It's like meaningful to you, because if you're creating multiple of these, we don't want AMD processors. So therefore, and again, with the SQL sides of things, this scenario is AWS is going to provide, because in this scenario, we know we need to upgrade our environment anyway. So this just gives a bit of an idea of, if we look at the environments, and it's live. So as you change the scenario and as you flip between environments, you're getting those kind of real-time costs associated to it. So just want to kind of give that bit of an idea of how flexible this can be, and how easily we can kind of answer those questions of, right, so we're going to build a scenario for my staging environment. How much is it going to cost me? Here's a cost for it. Just going to pause again for a second just to check if there's any questions. Okay, just the one question here. Let me just do. Yeah, one question. So, so who builds out the scenarios, and do I get access? So yes, you absolutely get access. The scenarios can be built out either by ourselves, working with AWS in this case here, or you actually get access to build these out yourself. So this is your data, right? So you'll know your requirements, but Perfect Image as an AWS partner provides the guidance and helps you along the way, and you can create as many scenarios as you like there. Right, so I'm just going to touch on parts, of the topic of a cloud migration strategy, to show how the data captured during the readiness assessment feeds into this. When we break this down, when we break down the cloud migration strategy, excuse me, it helps us to understand the migration, like what the migration involves. So you got to build your business case, you define your strategy, plan your migration, look at your teams, the strengths, the technical expertise, migrate in phases. It took Netflix close to 8 years to move from on-premise to cloud, but this allowed them to evolve their offering, to their customers. As part of assessing each workload, we do perform the 6 R's, right? So what are the 6 R's? So I'll talk you through these and kind of discuss kind of how and kind of where they're assessed. So this is based upon the migration phase itself, right? So retain. So which workloads are going to be retained? They're going to be kept where they are. There's going to be no change made. What workloads are going to be retired? We then move into kind of rehost. So these are the ones that we're going to do along the more of a lift and shift. So we're just going to change the take an image, lift it, put it either within AWS or Azure, and actually run as it was. Replatform, so it's a bit more, so it's kind of like your lift and shift with a bit of a jiggle. So you might be updating the OS here, so you might be going from 2008 to 2019, or broader changes. So you're moving from typical SQL to Amazon's RDS, or Azure SQL. Then we kind of move on to refactor. So this is where we get more significant changes coming in, and a lot more re-engineering on the applications to make them kind of either more cloud native. And then repurchase. So which candidates are basically ones where you're going to migrate from typical IaaS applications to SaaS-based solutions. So Exchange to Exchange Online, SharePoint Online, CRM, so forth. So if we look at the percentages of what happens during, what happens for each of these during a typical cloud migration, and it's for that cloud migration phase. So there's typically 10% of workloads retained where they are. Only 5% will typically be retired. That kind of rehosts, so lift and shift. This is a large section here, and it all depends upon the speed of which you need to move into the cloud as well. But you've got 40%. Replatform, again, 30%. Refactoring, we're only seeing 5%, and then the repurchase, about 10%. So this band in the middle here, so this is 70% of what typically happens during a cloud migration. So how do you translate strategy and effort into an actual cloud adoption plan? Well, when developing the adoption plan, you're kind of going to ask yourself, how are you organizing your people and teams for the cloud transformation? Where does the accountability reside for applications and its availability? What are the current skill gaps? How are your people trained, right? So do they have the skills required, and kind of what are those upskill plans? And then also, what are the priorities, and the list of applications that you want to move to the cloud? Just pause for a moment, just to give you just to review the points on screen before I kind of start within a wrap up. So what are the key takeaways from this session? So understand your cloud readiness. This is the starting point of any cloud migration and the building blocks for a business case. Create that cloud migration strategy. It's not too late. It's never too late. So define, build, plan, adopt, govern, manage, and communicate. Critical on that communication side of things right across the business. So assess the cloud providers. So who you choose now may not be your cloud provider in 3 to 5 years. Always build an exit strategy into your cloud migration strategy. Manage. So manage, monitor, deliver those expected outcomes. Right. So ensure the cloud environment is secure. It's compliant and in line with your governance models. But then also repeat, right? So once you've created your cloud migration strategy, that's not the end. Iterate, and continue to communicate. Right. So questions. Just before I move into the questions, I will launch one last poll, and then I'll move into kind of answering a few more questions that are popping up. Just going to give it a couple more seconds. Okay, we've got 70% come through. So 5 more seconds and I'll close the poll. Okay, so what have we got? 75% found it useful. Excellent. Perfect. Good refresher, and I'll be my way. Not a problem. Happy with that. It's all about just discussing communication. Things change. So what I'll do is I'll just go through a couple of questions now and see what we've got coming through. But what I will say is, before everyone ducks off as well, is that after the session today is you will be sent a link regarding a readiness assessment, but also there is a handout section. So there is a section within this document. So basically, for this presentation. Okay, so question 1, what have we got? So I don't know where to start. We're currently using cloud services, but I don't know why we've chosen the current cloud provider or what our real strategy is. That's not uncommon. But for this, we need to know, kind of a bit more information about this one. So what we'll do is we'll contact you, and please sign up for the readiness assessment. And what we'll do is we'll understand your current workloads more and understand what your objectives are. It's never too late to build that cloud migration strategy, and it should always be reviewed, updated, and challenged. Another question. So I'm a heavy Microsoft user, and all servers are Windows-based. Should I only consider Azure, or is AWS an option? So kind of, I think, like I covered off during a little bit as we went on, just because you're running those Microsoft workloads, it isn't the reason enough to only kind of consider Azure. So AWS definitely has more Windows workloads running it than Microsoft does within Azure. And also they offer heavy incentives to move your Windows workloads to AWS, but also to move to more cloud native solutions. But we do need to consider, what your objectives are, right? So if the goal is to consume more 365 services and decommission these services, then that may push you more towards the Azure side. But also, if you have 2008 workloads, then Microsoft offers extended support on those servers. I think there's still 2 years remaining on those ones, so that's kind of more of a push to Azure. Okay, I think that's it. Let me just check for one more. No, so that's all the questions. So please, so again, in the links that will be set following this, if you want to fill those out and request kind of access for the free readiness assessment, and again, there is that kind of handout section there for a copy of this presentation. So I'll hang on the line for another kind of 2-3 minutes just to see if there are any more questions come in. But otherwise, thank you very much for your time. So I do have 2 questions here. I don't know. Sorry, I just deleted one. I have to go back into that one, but we'll get in touch for that one there. Sorry, I clicked the wrong button there. So what considerations need to be made when considering if an application is ready for the cloud? So depending whether you're after high availability, fault tolerance, whether it's licenses as well. So can we run multiple instances of this? What services do we need to consume for this? We have plenty of environments that we have created where we've actually moved an application and we've made it kind of HA, whether that is with having kind of active-active or active-passive, just by being creative around what services we use when building out that environment. Okay, I'm going to end the session. Thanks again.